Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for pitching up, coming along to here. And straight after lunch, I'm not sure this is the worst slot or the best slot. It depends how much you've eaten, I suppose. Anyway, I just want to inform you that if I ran out of steam at some stage, I have been this morning giving a talk at the Chartered Institute of Linguists. And I left their venue at 1:15, so I haven't had an enormous amount of break time either. That was a different thing, but I was still talking from another perspective about conference interpreting. Can I start off by saying that I am a conference interpreter, and that there has been some discussion about whether or not I was able to talk about public service interpreting, which is a different thing. And let me say right away that I probably know as much about it as many people who've been in the language professions for many years, but I am not a public service interpreter, and I have never actually participated in any area where there are public service interpreters. So that is my sort of disqualifier. But the qualification, of course, is that I know many people who do practice, who are public service interpreters. And I'm a member of the working group on public service interpretation as an external advisor. So through my contacts with those people, I have learned quite a lot. So this is just to be clear to you, I'm a conference interpreter, and when you ask questions, we might be perhaps looking at the differences. Who I am, first of all, and what my organization or institution actually does. I put up immediately two pictures for you. Pictures speak louder than words very often. This is David Smith, who's the head of the English language unit in the European Commission's Directorate General for Interpreting. He, therefore, is important in the sense that he's directly concerned with recruiting professionals, interpreters of English mother tongue, of which we have a shortage. I hope you'll be glad to hear that news. And myself, I'm the person who's majorly in contact with international organizations, so that's all the language professions, and I also organize study visits for groups of conference interpreting students. So between us, I do quite a lot of these talks, awareness raising and such like. Between us, we're very interested in finding new blood. Now that is the first and most important thing. I'll just tell you briefly, I studied, as it says here, German and French, by the way, at Southampton University several centuries ago, and my very first job was as a disc jockey. And if I had only been able to stay as a disc jockey, I would have been very happy. But I thought, some sort of aging female Tony Blackburn wasn't quite the picture, although one couldn't imagine then what aging Tony Blackburn would look like, and it's not that bad. But I did this in the student club in Freiburg, in Breisgau, where I was living, and also on the radio there. And it was a very, very good start to the profession I now have. Why? Because, first of all, you learn what you sound like, listening to yourself on the radio show. I hated the sound of my own voice, but at least I do know what it sounds like. I learned how to use a microphone, not to be scared of mics. People are sometimes. And in the student club where I was disc jockey, you also learn how to gauge people's reactions. If you wanted them to dance, you could put this, that, and the other music on. I don't think this has changed much either. If you wanted them to dance, this was so the guys at the bar got more money because people got hot and drank more. Right, you don't have to hear all this story about disc jockeying. I then became a translator for a few years in Frankfurt, so I have some knowledge of translation too. And then Brussels was looking for people with languages to train them as interpreters. We couldn't find enough people after the UK accession. There weren't enough being trained from the existing interpreting schools, and so we ran an in-house training course for several years. And I am a product of that training course. So I became an interpreter, decided I would stay in Brussels for maybe 4 or 5 years, and I hate to say it, I'm still there. And reasonably happily so. So it has been a very interesting profession with ups and downs. I always tell people that actually I've had huge fun, which I have. Why not tell you that? But it's also hard work. So there's the two sides to it. If you make it, it's really very, very rewarding. Let me just say briefly then where I come from, because it's just as well to have a background as well. I come from the European Commission's Directorate General for Interpretation, commonly known as SCIC, S-C-I-C. That's our abbreviated name, and it stands for the Service Commun Interprétation et Conférence, which, as you might gather if you have French, is Joint Interpreting and Conference Service. So when I say SCIC, it's to avoid this lengthy title. We are about 750 staff in all, a huge Directorate General. 550-ish are staff interpreters, so they have passed the open competition and are permanent staff, and all the others are recruited freelancers on a daily basis. I put here we have 60 meetings a day. That's a lot to cover, actually, and about 700 interpreters are therefore working on any given day in our service. Again, that should be good news, because this means that we do need people very much indeed, and we are very short of English mother tongue recruits. We're short of pretty well everything, but especially English mother tongue recruits. A quick word on languages, why we're there at all. I'm sure you know this already, but I'm just summing it up for you to remind you that we have 23 official and working languages in the EU, and there are 6 in the United Nations. That has stayed constant for some time and doesn't look like changing. But at any rate, we're committed to multilingualism, both organizations, and I quickly sum you up there, but you know it already, I'm sure, what those official and working languages are in the EU. It's just a reminder. Then why do we need people doing these professions at all? Why do we need translators and interpreters? Because we are committed to multilingualism. It's stated in the First Council regulation that the members' languages are equal and are official and working languages, and that is how we proceed. Neither is multilingualism, contrary to much of what the British press has to say, neither is it particularly expensive. We cost actually €2 a year per citizen. And those who've heard this talk before, my friends up there for a start, I've taken out the cup of coffee. I'm sure you're absolutely relieved to hear it. They know what I'm talking about, it's okay. I know that you had a talk this morning on the difference between the two professions, but we'll just quickly have another look. It is worthwhile remembering what interpreting is and what translation is, bearing in mind that many people that I know and my colleagues will know do practice both professions. So the interpreting is rendering the message pretty well quickly, if not simultaneously. It's verbal communication. And if I had to compare our profession with any other at all, I would suggest we are probably closer to actors than anything else. I don't know if you agree with that. We are not translators, though, as I said, we can do both professions, but they require different qualities and different aptitudes. In the EU and in the UN, we are large enough that we make a separation. The translators are in one place and the interpreters in another. There isn't any sort of mixture. The IMF, for example, recruits interpreter translators, so there you would need a knowledge of both. But in the big markets like ours, we separate the professions. And on the private market, as I said, many do both. The freelance translators, this is just briefly to sum up how the freelance translators are recruited via an agency in the EU. You don't just send your CV. I've had lots of people asking me this question, how can I get in? You get in by joining a decent agency, which you will research yourself and work for. And it is the call for tenders system that's used in the Commission's Directorate General for Translation. So tenders are put out when they need work done. If you're part of an agency that works for the EU, you will be doing that job. And when you've been there for a few years, you can also set yourself up as a lone tenderer, so working alone, but not at the beginning. So, join an agency. To join as a staff interpreter or translator, or any staff, you have to go through the EPSO process. That's the European Personnel Selection Office. And that is the way open competitions are organized. There you have the 3 European institutions, Parliament, Commission, and Court of Justice, all together running their recruitments. So whether you're sitting as a translator or an administrator or an interpreter, it is through EPSO that you will work. That is where you will apply to. Open competitions are run every so many years, depending on our needs. It is not an annual thing, and you have to look for when they're published. A lot of people have complained that the tests or the examination procedures were not good because they didn't give good translators and interpreters a chance to prove themselves, because you've got all these numeracy tests that precede the actual translation and interpretation. But this is all being overhauled. That's good news for you. Have a look at the EPSO website, and bear in mind that in future, for linguists, things will be much more adapted to our professions. So I'm glad to say things ought to get better. Now, I have to say a few words about public service interpreting because it's there and I was asked to do so. It's different from conference interpreting, just for a start. I've looked things up myself because, as I said, I am not a public service interpreter, but where most of the public service work will be is in the police, welfare, education, housing, and such like. And interpreters in public service are called all sorts of different things. There doesn't seem to be a real agreement on what term. In this country, we say public service. In other places, they talk about legal interpreting, or court interpreting, or community. And there is a register, which you can be on if you're a public service interpreter, called the National Register for Public Service Interpretation, which is run by the Chartered Institute of Linguists, which also run the examination for this, to be put on this register. So you would have a look at their website too. Now, several universities run courses, masters in public service. I know a little bit about some of them, but it would be worth your while finding out what these courses contain, what is required. They exist, and you would require such a qualification to practice as a public service interpreter. The work is very different from the sort of thing we do in Brussels. I'm not saying one is better or more difficult, or they're just totally different. If you're working, for example, say for asylum organizations, you very likely will be somebody who has two almost mother tongues, and you might be interpreting in consecutive rather than in simultaneous, but consecutive note-taking and on-the-spot talking to people, between people, in, for example, Farsi and English, or I just take any example. The work, therefore, will be more face-to-face, more person-to-person. Most of the work of a conference interpreter will be in large-scale meetings and in simultaneous mode, whereas the public service is more likely to be in consecutive mode. Please stop me if any of these terms are completely foreign to you, and I will be happy to explain them. So, the assignments can vary. And I note some of the qualifications and aptitudes that I've heard about from other public service interpreters, which are very much the same as those we need in conference interpreting. Tact, aptitude for communication, sensitivity, ability to listen. There are quite a number which would cover both just as well. You need to find out about the area you're working in. Now that's the same for us too. If I know that I'm interpreting for finance ministers tomorrow, I will read up a lot about finance. Probably read up and have a look at the agenda of the meeting, read the newspapers. For all professions involving interpreting, you need to be able to read up, study, find out. You don't just go into a meeting hoping for the best. There's usually a lot of documentation to prepare you, but at any rate, these are issues that are very well addressed nowadays, and all sorts of assistance is given. You don't normally find yourself straight into a meeting on a strange topic without preparation. So that's just a few words about the assignments and the qualifications needed and the areas of work for public service interpreting. Now let's move on to conference interpreting, which I know you've heard about today too, but let me say a few words about conference interpreting for the international organizations, because that is a specific area that I represent. Well, we need a university degree, just as the public service interpreters do. We need training in conference interpreting. Now, I have just come from a meeting of professionals, and I was asked again a question by one of them. I've studied, said this person, public service interpreting, and I have the diploma. Can I apply to you? No, is the answer. You cannot. You need to have studied and be qualified in conference interpreting in order to sit a test with the EU or with the United Nations. So I think that has to be made absolutely clear because it keeps coming back. You need to be able to speak your mother tongue clearly, or any language into which you're interpreting. Now, that might sound sort of obvious to you, but it's a problem we're having. We don't find enough English-speaking interpreters. Lots of other problems as well, but English-speaking especially. And sometimes we find people who can interpret and have the required number of languages, but they don't master the right register. It's very important for you to speak a language that is the language of meetings. So your English might be really very good, but if you don't manage to adapt to the register of a ministerial meeting, say, then this is not going to work. So it's another thing to add. You have to be clear, obviously. You know, when I interpret into English, or any of my colleagues do, we're not just being listened to by English speakers. We're being listened to by many, many others. And our mode of speech has to be clear. Absolutely, everybody has to be able to understand us. So clearly and fluently, I underline, register. And then, of course, you have to comply with whatever the regulations are at the time, the requirements. And then, finally, don't please send us your CVs, because that's not how it works in the international organizations. You would have to pass a test. So let's say you've qualified, you've come here, you've been to Westminster University, you've followed the course here, and you've passed it. The next stage will be applying to us for an accreditation test, and if you pass it, you are accredited to the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the Court of Justice. So then we would recruit you on a daily basis when we need you, not every single day, obviously. And the other thing is the open competition that I've mentioned, if you wanted to become a staff interpreter. Now, I know lots of people who have very definite views, much prefer to be staff, like to have the idea of the money coming in on the 15th of the month and staying with one organization. Equally, I have lots of friends who prefer the freelance life, are happy to be able to work for different organizations, to work on the private market. So that is very much up to the person concerned. I wouldn't say one wins out over the other, but the important news is that for us, whichever you do, you will test for 3 different institutions. The kind of tests that are run will be known to you because you will have been training in any of the university courses, the master's courses that we work with. That is Westminster and Bath and Leeds universities. Those are the 3 from which we mainly recruit our interpreters. And they will have taught you, first of all, what is required to pass our test and what is required to pass the open competition. And so you'll be very well equipped to come and sit our test. Oh, what do I do about this? Just get rid of it. Now the myths. I have been to about 8 or 9 universities this year. Universities not running interpreting courses, I would add. Southampton, my own university, Durham, and other places, with 150, 200 and more students listening. And I still get the same myths coming back at me. People have heard in schools from their teachers that they need certain qualifications to become an interpreter, and most of it is wrong. Let me say that very clearly. I hope that things will improve, but a lot of teachers in schools, I think, are not aware of what is required. For a start, you do not need to speak several languages fluently. That is what most students come and tell me they can do. And they ask me what I can do. I speak 1 fluently. I speak English. I hope you find this fluent because this is my language into which I work. Fluent English I speak, and everything else I understand, because I work on the strength of 1 active language, English, from 3 passive languages, French, German, and Italian in my case. And that is more or less the rule. Now, of course, with lots of exceptions, and I'll mention some of them. But whatever it is you're interpreting into, that is what you speak fluently. And no one cares whether you're Italian, you're Russian, or anything else, or your Lithuanian is very fluid, because you won't be using it. You only be listening to it. You don't have to know 5 languages. I have a colleague in Brussels who had to fight battles all through school and university, listening to her teachers saying, you'll never get to do that job, forget that profession, you haven't got 5 languages and you're not a genius. Now, those of us in the profession know that that is a lot of rubbish. We do not need 5. For the case of Brussels, what we really would like at the moment, if you happen to be English mother tongue, but you don't have to be, I'm mentioning that because I happen to be in an English-speaking country here, plus 2 languages. If one of them could be German, we would like that very much, because that is our biggest shortage. Show of hands, how many people have English mother tongue and no German? Oh, that's interesting. And another language, is that the same show of hands? Yeah, it looks about the same. Good. This is a very good start. If you have English mother tongue and you know Russian, I'm thinking of my United Nations friends here. What about that? Oh dear, a little bit thinner on this ground, but very good. They're very, very short of Russian. Mother tongue French with Russian, even more difficult. These are the language combinations that are currently most in need. Now, of course, we also have a shortage of interpreters working into Lithuanian from, say, English and another language, also Estonian, also Maltese, and do I go on? I can stand here and name all of them. We have a shortage for everything. So we are supporting all the courses that are run in the member states and elsewhere, which are training interpreters for us in all these languages. I was in Vilnius week before last on a panel for their final and intermediate exams. So testing for the university exams, not for Brussels. 4 days of very tough stuff. Some of these people are very good, many of them are good, and there will be a smallish proportion who will be able to test with us and pass and come and work for us. But we send our people to those universities to help train up to our level. We need English mother tongue, you've heard that, you've got that message now, I sincerely hope, but we will never ever drop our standards. The quality is always got to be met. If we are short of English to the extent of saying to people, sorry, we're cancelling the meeting because we've no English interpreters, we will do it. We are doing it every single week. We do not hire people recruit people, unless they're up to our level. Another myth, I hope my colleagues there will be happy with this, the myth is that absolutely anybody who happens to know languages in a university can also train interpreters. No, they can't. And if you want to follow a course for interpreting, you will have to find out whether that course is run by and taught by conference interpreters as well. You cannot teach it unless you can do it. Now, some are better than others at teaching. Some of us have a pedagogical qualification, not everybody. But this is essential. And if it's the excellent literature teacher, German literature, who's teaching interpreting, it's not going to work. I won't go into why it doesn't. You must be able to do the job to teach it. The chronology, reasonably important. There are exceptions to this rule, but this is more or less the chronology of an interpreting course, starting with memory, concentration, moving on to a note-taking technique, consecutive note-taking technique. That's what, the public service interpreters use most of the time. And then finally, you move on to simultaneous interpreting. That's the way it works. In most successful courses, it works like that. Now I've got some funny pictures for you, because you might be falling asleep. The terrible shortage of, no, they don't look too happy about it, I must admit, but we need high-level interpreters because all sorts of meetings are taking place all the time where interpreters are required. As you may have noticed, there have been a lot of meetings recently where you know that interpreters are going to be needed. These are just a few examples. These are the documented main shortages after sending out a survey to our friends and members elsewhere. Though this is what we came up with. English mother tongue, top of the list. Secondly, Arabic in conjunction with other languages, English mainly or French. Also passive Russian, passive German, Chinese as well. But those are the things that international organizations say they are mainly lacking. The other thing we're doing to try to get more recruits and to encourage people is precisely what I'm doing right here and have been doing in all these other universities, attending careers events. I personally think this is a very good thing to do because you can talk to people and answer questions, and you're really showing everybody for them to see that you do the job, you know what it's like, and you come from that area. We're also doing all sorts of press campaigns and all sorts of other things to try and encourage people to join us. But careers events, which only run, as far as I know, in UK and Ireland, are a very good way to do it. And then some good news, Roots into Languages. Now, of course, I have to pay tribute here to Roots into Languages. Excellent initiative. It is certainly putting some money, finally, into language tuition, language training, language careers, and we're very glad to see that. So, please support Roots into Languages and its follow-up. I hope there will be one. I mentioned here that there are national networks in Roots into Language, for interpreting and for translation. And Westminster is very much part of this as well. And to sum up what Mike Kelly of Southampton says, this is all about universities working together with professional bodies. A lot of professionals say we've had excellent people coming out of training, especially for translation, by the way, but they don't know how to work in a professional environment. That's why the contact between the two constituencies is so important. Now, not everybody may recognize this picture. One chap in the last talk I gave said, what film was that? Does everybody know or heard of the film The Interpreter? Well, I think, but I don't know if my colleagues agree, that it did us a good turn. I think it wasn't bad at all. It didn't get stuff wrong, because I have seen, half and half. I've seen some so-called films with interpreters in them where everything was wrong, nothing was realistic or authentic. At least Nicole had some training from the United Nations and actually watched and listened to interpreters. So it isn't too bad an example. I mean, not everybody looks like Nicole Kidman, we know that. But at any rate, she did, I thought, a reasonably decent job. What do we need? And certainly what she has, of course, we said clarity in the active language. General knowledge, please. People flunk tests because they don't read enough. Please remember that. Issues that are going on in all countries and in the press, you need to know what's happening. I gave a speech in Vilnius a couple of weeks ago on the subject of expenses and MPs in this country. Now, you're all grinning there because you think, how could anybody not know about all that scandal? And Vilnius is, of course, quite far away from here, and these are students who work with English. And I've told them, and their teachers have told them many times, you must know what's going on in the countries of your languages. And I hate to say this, blank. No reaction at all, and a lot of mistakes that only were made because the students, just a couple of them concerned, had not read the papers and didn't know about bird baths and moats and other things that have been going on in this country. I was surprised to see, but it was a very good illustration of why they should have read the papers. And of course, we need to be able to analyze what people are saying and to communicate. I think that goes without saying. I better move on quickly. Examples of other things we need: diplomacy, tact, and background knowledge. I keep coming with background knowledge, but it's so important. Diplomacy, imagine a situation such as this. Of course you need to be a diplomat. Very important indeed. Know what you're talking about. Have genned up. What do we do now? We help train student interpreters by bringing groups of them when they are training. So we have groups from Westminster University. Every year we take a group to show them how the EU meetings are. We give them a day in the European Commission where they listen to meetings and practice, not with the mic on, but get to hear what reality is like, and the same in the European Parliament. Participate, as I was doing last week, in the exams. Go and teach in all the universities. We sent a lot of people to give assistance in teaching, and offer bursaries. 160 maximum bursaries per year are offered to students if they apply and if they fulfill the criteria, those whose languages we most need. We work together with other organizations a lot. YAMLAPT, you don't have to worry about that awful acronym, but it is an international annual meeting which brings together the heads of conference and language services. We're all going to meet up for our annual bash in Tunis, which might be quite nice this year at the end of June. Hard work to prepare for it, but we will have our meeting at the African Development Bank, about 130 of us, and that's everybody doing a bit of brainstorming on what's needed, where we can cooperate, and how we're going to attract people to the professions. And this is one bit of it. Of course, I'm sorry, you have to look at this because I set it up. It's the Universities Contact Group, where we bring together colleagues from international organizations and from universities, precisely to bridge the gap between the two. Have a look at the website if you're interested, because that is not password protected, www.yamlabtp, you try and pronounce it, .org. It's myself and Svetlana who are the co-chairs. And this is a quick run-through of an interpreter's week. Finance ministers, press conference, standby duty, off to London for a day, back to Brussels, into a language course, and then a meeting of informal ministers in Prague. Now, it doesn't always look like that, but that is not far away from reality. And here are the pictures. This is probably the more public service interpreting, the famous Gorbachev interpreter. Mr. Sarkozy, who features on almost everything you look up nowadays on the internet with Gordon Brown. Wonder how long that slide is going to be relevant. And Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev meeting with two interpreters behind them. Up a mountain in a cable car where I found myself on my first ever mission. The Olympics with Boris. Number 10 with Mr. Major. And one of the nicer missions I had, Montego Bay. We do get to go to a slaughterhouse in Ireland, I remember too. That was one of my first, so that offsets the Montego Bay. We travel. We travel an awful lot. Mr. Sarkozy with his interpreter whispering to him, and there will be one behind Mr. Putin. Yeah, this is history. And the pros and cons. Communication, teamwork, traveling, lots of subjects. On the other side, too much variety. Perhaps uncreative. I said it's the actor. We do not make up the lines. We have to enact, and we have to communicate somebody else's ideas. It's true. And if a good speaker is there and we're interpreting a good speaker speaking his or her mother tongue, that's great. And sometimes people are not speaking their mother tongue quite as clearly as other people. And there's one example. There was a certain degree, a sort of frisson ran through the European Parliament whenever John Prescott appeared in the past. And people rang in ill. Because it was such a challenge. And you know what I mean very well. They didn't realize at the beginning, but the word went round pretty quickly. He looks fed up, doesn't he? Poor man. There you are, websites. Thank you very much for your attention.